Okay, I'll continue now with the penultimate slide set of our presentation, introductory presentation of J. Edgar Hoover. And his rise to power, part 3, the Bureau of Injustice. Hoover the chameleon. Attorney General Stone had criticized the outrageous tactics employed against the civil rights of Americans during the Red Scare. Having just been appointed as the Bureau's acting director, Edgar used his chameleon talents to suddenly turn into Edgar the Moderate. Within 10 days of his appointment, he was assuring a Senate committee that the Bureau would no longer investigate citizens because of their political opinions. In his search, Stone asked Edgar to meet with the director of the American Civil Liberties Union, Roger Baldwin. Baldwin had accused Edgar of operating a secret police system. Baldwin had seen the evidence of the telephone tapping equipment that Edgar said did not exist. Baldwin also saw the phony plans for a local union made up of government informants. But incredibly, Baldwin fell for Edgar's silver-tongued promise that a new era had dawned. As a result, Baldwin foolishly told Stone that he'd been wrong about Mr. Hoover's attitude. In the end, Edgar's appointment as the director was the prize. Be quiet. The Bureau of Injustice. When Hoover died on 2 May 1972, Roger Baldwin was 93 years old. As a result, he was able to peruse the old Bureau of Investigation files on the American Civil Liberties Union. Baldwin was astonished to learn that even during Stone's tenure as Attorney General, Hoover had an ACLU informant in place. Baldwin saw that Edgar was reading the pilfered reports of the ACLU's meetings, complete with minutes and names of contributors. And the Bureau was still using police intelligence to spy on the ACLU as late as 1977. Not surprisingly, during the entirety of that period, Hoover refused to acknowledge whether those operations were continuing. Edgar blundered by appointing his right-wing crony George Roach as his senior aide. That caused a public uproar, and the new Attorney General, Harlan Fiske Stone, vetoed that plan. Nevertheless, on 22 December 1924, Stone confirmed Hoover's permanent appointment as director of the Bureau of Investigation. Edgar continued to hold that post for the next 48 years. During all of those years, no president had the guts to fire him. Marking time while purging deadbeats. Hoover understood that Attorney General Stone's smackdown of the Roach appointment was a bad omen. So Edgar wisely yielded so as not to squander a golden opportunity of assuming the helm of the Bureau. Due to the chaos of the Harding presidency, America longed for more efficient government administrators who would embrace the wonders of emerging technologies and the promise of a better education for their children. Edgar was betting, correctly, that responding to this calling would ensure a safe consolidation of its power first. New horizons, along with the freedom to use newly acquired power as he wished, would come later. There were plenty of corrupt agents and agents hanging around doing little true investigative work that Edgar could fire. Along with the accompanying fanfare, Hoover closed more than 25 field offices, and within 5 years had cut the number of agents to 339, about a quarter of the force. Hoover decreed that his agents had to be between 25 and 35 and have a background in law or accounting. The Bureau of Kid Napoleon. Hoover learned many lessons from his former experience with the Central High School debate team. His arguments were based on conservative concepts of Protestant faith, like affirming, quote, the fallacies of women's suffrage, close quote. And according to Lerone Martin's biography of Hoover, this factory of white upward mobility proudly practiced segregation and anti-black racism. Graduation speakers routinely cracked jokes about innate black inferiority, while the school's assortment of publications were littered with homages to white supremacy. As Edgar consolidated his power in the early 1920s, he expected his agents to adhere to the motto, for God, country, and J. Edgar Hoover. But privately, his agents told a different story. They referred to him as Kid Napoleon. Okay. Yeah. Goon squads and double yokers. Anthony Summers' description of Edgar's cleanup of the Agent Corps includes these bawdy details. Once agents were married, Edgar kept a strict eye on them. Heads of FBI field offices, known as agents in charge, were under orders to inform him if colleagues were having affairs outside of their marriages. Edgar called such men double yokers. Generations of agents lived in terror. The inspection teams, known as GOON squads. Their task was to descend without warning to sniff out the most trivial transgression, like an airline schedule left in a desk drawer that should contain only official papers, or laundry left in the wrong place, even dirty clothes left behind a radiator. Edgar would claim his own office got the same treatment, which was a lie. Edgar made the Bureau unique and indispensable, however. He brought modernity to law enforcement. He moved into the director's office in 1924, hefting several boxes of dog-eared fingerprint cards. These, coupled with 800,000 prints sent to the old bureau from Leavenworth Penitentiary, were the germ of a technological revolution. Waiting like a snake to strike. Hoover understood that Americans had a deep-seated fear of a national police force. He therefore worked shrewdly to project that he would never create such a force, even as he was in fact doing so. Summers picks up the story here. Edgar always limited the Bureau to what he knew it could do successfully. He avoided accepting a mandate to police drug trafficking, for example, because he feared exposing his agents to corruption and because there was little chance of easy success. So it was that other agencies had to deal with narcotics and violations of prohibition, smuggling, forgery, and immigration offenses. Indeed, while Edgar was director, the Bureau had jurisdiction over a minute percentage of the serious crimes committed in the United States. Go figure. What kind of Department of Justice was that? Hoover waited for the wave of crimes in the 30s to react with zeal and massive publicity campaigns to showcase his enthusiastic countermeasures. This circus enabled him to get hold of public funds to build a large crime records entity he called Division 8. Martin Luther King's first taste of racism. By the mid-1930s, Martin Luther King Jr. was just a toddler in Atlanta, Georgia. Although it was a southern town in which Jim Crow was still dominant, young King had yet to experience the bitter taste of racism. When he turned 6, he had to attend a school for blacks and was suddenly no longer able to play with his white friends. As a child, Edgar, too, learned the rules of segregation and white supremacy. As a man, he became acclimated to the fusion of white supremacy with religion, whether Catholicism or Presbyterian. Women and African Americans had no seat at this table of white male virtue. This arrangement empowered those who trumpeted white power then and still does so today. King Jr. never forgot the moment that his white friend told him that his father demanded that he would play with King no more. King learned later that many white people were against racism, but his childhood disappointments never faded. Summary. Once Hoover got a foot in the door of the Bureau, he played his cards with the cunning craft of a chameleon. Hoover morphed, as Anthony Summers put it, into Edgar the Moderate by purging large numbers of the Bureau's corrupt agents. Once crowned as the director, however, it was game on. Edgar immediately fired women from the Agent Corps and began to employ most of his agent force less for finding criminals than to spy on anyone with political power or anyone in the media who had made the slightest critical comment about him. By the time Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in 1929, one of Edgar's favorite high school debate team targets, civil rights, had already become a key linchpin in a fairy tale he used cunningly to spread fear that communists were hiding behind every tree. Okay, I'll finish now with the final slide set on this introductory topic of J. Edgar Hoover, his rise to power, Part 4, A Legacy of Lies and Spies. Fingerprints and hair fibers. Hoover made the most of his organizational skills and new technology. Edgar's fingerprint bureau grew from one small file room to a large L-shaped clearinghouse high in the Department of Justice, and eventually to a 6-story building occupying an entire city block. By the 60s, it was said that the fingerprint cards, stacked one on top of another, would reach 113 times higher than the Empire State Building. By the time Edgar died, a vast computerized identification division offered instant access to the swirls, loops, and arches of the fingers of 159 million people. Edgar developed a massive crime laboratory, room after room in which rows of experts pored over ballistics evidence and analyzed poisons, hairs, and fibers. The FBI crime laboratory quickly became the most advanced in the world and the key to the expansion of Edgar's empire. Hoover capped this impressive overhaul in 1935 by creating a police training school that became the FBI National Academy. The explosion of domestic spying under Roosevelt. In 1935, the word federal was finally added to the name, Bureau of Investigation. The word spying and unjust would have been more appropriate. Public pressure during the 1938 Nazi trials led President Roosevelt to increase funds for intelligence. Edgar said he wanted the money for domestic spying on Americans at home and would use, quote, the utmost degree of secrecy, close quote, to avoid criticism. Roosevelt happily gave Edgar the go-ahead. Hoover's agent force expanded from 1,000 in 1937 to 4,000 at the end of the war. Not all the agents were used for wartime security. The Bureau gathered vast amounts of information on ordinary people of liberal persuasion and on innocuous groups. There was a massive investigation of the NAACP involving the extensive use of informants. EDGAR saw to it that all information on thousands of innocent citizens was duly filed away for future reference. The spying and phone tapping of government officials caused a public crisis in Congress. The Bureau of Injustice. Hoover survived the crisis, gratis of Roosevelt, who poo-pooed the crisis and underlined that with a nice letter to Hoover in July 1940. FDR asked EDGAR to look over a pile of critical telegrams. Summers states that the FBI political espionage for the White House became routine. He picks up the story here. As time went on, Roosevelt often bypassed his attorney general and communicated directly with EDGAR. A long line of future attorneys general, who theoretically had full authority over the director of the FBI, would have to learn to live with the same humiliation. As Secretary Ickes noted in his diary in June 1941, EDGAR had become so strong that apparently he can dictate who is to be the Attorney General, his titular chief. The fact was, though, that for the first time in the nation's history, a federal official did wield such power, and his assault on civil liberties would be persistent and serious. Operation Tricycle and the Pearl Harbor attack. In April 1940, Winston Churchill met secretly with William Stephenson. Stephenson was the protagonist of his own best-selling book, A Man Called Intrepid. William was also a World War I flying ace, a prison camp escapee, a radio and television pioneer, and a successful businessman. President Roosevelt had been in secret communication for several months with Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty. The United Kingdom was financially destitute. Even worse, the disoriented British military was facing a German invasion. Churchill was desperate to find a way to drag the United States into a war at a time when powerful U.S. elites opposed such involvement. Against those long odds, Churchill had just one card to play. Britain had broken the German military communications code. Called the Enigma machine, it was thought perhaps to be the ultimate key to victory over Germany in World War II. Churchill's decision meant that Roosevelt would be the only foreigner to know the UK had the keys to the Abwehr, German military intelligence. The secret channel to Hoover. According to Anthony Summers, Churchill ordered Stephenson to share the Enigma secret with Roosevelt to him and him alone. But FDR stipulated that the United Kingdom's daily intelligence summary should be delivered to him through the FBI. However, Hoover was not supposed to be privy to the intelligence from Enigma, a provision that obviously would lead to a lot of trouble. William met EDGAR in his Washington home. EDGAR moved there after his mother died, and he lived alone. Once inside, as William looked around, he noticed an abundance of male nudes. Summers picks it up here. There were, Stephenson would recall, nude figurines, nudes on the stairway, and pictures of rather suggestive male nudes all over the place. He would soon meet EDGAR in the company of Clyde Tolson and recognize them as a homosexual couple. Soon after that meeting, Roosevelt ordered, quote, the closest possible marriage between the FBI and British intelligence, unquote. Within the first year, the British base in New York City delivered 100,000 reports to the FBI. Japan's interest in Pearl Harbor. Trouble began when Roosevelt named Colonel William Donovan as the new coordinator of information. Stephenson was pleased, as many others were. They liked Donovan. Hoover hated it and began treating foreigners with contempt in late 1941, just a couple of months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. At that time, a double agent dealing with the Allies and Germans was brought into play. He was a Yugoslav named Dusan Popov. Summers picks it up here. Asked to go to England as a German spy, Popov promptly made contact with British intelligence. There he was told to play along with the Germans and keep reporting back to the British. The Germans took the bait. Popov, codenamed TRICYCLE by MI5, that would be their version of the FBI, spent the first half of 1941 shuttling back and forth between Portugal and England, always returning to Lisbon with phony information for the Abwehr. The Germans asked Popov to make a spy ring in the United States. That was a stroke of luck, because it could then be used for deception by MI6, the British version of the CIA. Crucially, the German request revealed Japanese interests in the details of Pearl Harbor. So Popov went immediately to the U.S. to brief Hoover's team on the plan. The Hoover Channel disaster. And wouldn't you know, at that critical moment, Hoover decided to take his friend, Clyde Tolson, on a nice vacation in Florida. Popov followed to find Edgar, bringing for cover a girlfriend with her mother as a chaperone. Edgar goes ballistic, and citing Popov's friend as a reason, Hoover refused to speak with Popov until much later in New York. Again, Summers picks up the story. Popov recalled how Edgar looked at him with disgust, how he had once started ranting and yelping. He turned purple with rage and called Popov a bogus spy who had done nothing useful since he arrived. Popov retorted that he always lived luxuriously, and that the Germans, who financed him generously, would think it odd if he did otherwise. He had been ineffective since his arrival only because the FBI had given him so little cooperation. But Edgar got angrier. The meeting ended up within minutes with Edgar shrieking, "Good riddance," as Popov departed quickly. Popov's information was solid, and the FBI was the correct place to secret it. The fact is that by throwing such a fit, Edgar Hoover failed to handle it correctly, and this was a terrible and unnecessary failure. Tragic. Edgar's hissy fit may well have contributed to the needless tragedy at Pearl Harbor. The game of dirty pool inside the American Civil Liberties Union. After the war, Dr. King began his graduate studies in Boston, about the time when the CIA finally took shape in 1951. The FBI had just established its 10 most wanted fugitives list. Hoover's personal attorney was a man named Morris L. Ernst, and he was a fanatic champion of the Bureau and of Hoover. His status as a giant of the civil liberties arena gave him the ability to effectively neutralize criticism of the FBI within the ACLU itself. Kurt Gentry picks up the story here. Ernst reported private and sometimes privileged conversations to Hoover. Unbeknownst to their authors, he gave Hoover copies of personal letters he had received from such FBI critics as the journalist I.F. Stone, the columnist Max Lerner, Congressman Wayne Morse, and the FCC chairman Lawrence Fly, who incidentally clashed with Hoover over the issue of wiretapping. Ernst led the fight to have the veteran communist Elizabeth Gurley Flynn removed from the ACLU's board of directors. Hoover's white line in the sand. Recall Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s graphic coverage of Hoover's racist remarks. In 1946, Hoover had complained to Attorney General Tom Clark that the Bureau was expending too much manpower investigating murders, lynchings, and assaults, particularly in the southern states. The result, Hoover said, was only to enrage vociferous minority groups when the Bureau failed to produce immediate results. In 1948, Joseph Rao asked Clark to have the FBI look into the attempted murder of Walter Reuther. Clark, after conferring with the director, brought back a crazy, irrelevant reply that was revealing for other reasons. He said, "Fellows, Edgar says no. He says he's not going to send the FBI in every time some nigger woman gets raped." Close quote. However, when King suddenly appeared as a prophet leading the black citizens of Montgomery in a boycott of the buses in that city, Hoover instantly jumped to send in his FBI goons to uncover all the derogatory information about King that they could find. I mentioned way back at the chapeau to this whole series with King and Hoover about the mole, Hoover's civil rights mole. Hoover had more weapons than Morris Ernst, whose remit was limited to the American Civil Liberties Union. In the early 1940s, Hoover had forced a former communist con artist to infiltrate into civil rights groups. That mandate did not surface until after the 1955 bus boycott, when Harry Belafonte had become a key member of Martin Luther King's inner circle. Belafonte was recruited by the con artist who, with his psychoanalyst wife, had been pumping Harry's brain for information on progressive African Americans. After a couple of years, Harry Belafonte figured out what was going on and informed his lawyer, who conducted a thorough research of the mole. The lawyer brokered a deal then with the mole, wherein the mole had to return the money he had extracted from Belafonte, who had to agree himself to keep the whole deal a secret. The dark details of that deal, along with a similar deal Stanley Levison had to make with this mole, con artist, surfaced in the days just after King's I Have a Dream speech in the nation's capital. This story is going to be in a forthcoming book of mine on Martin Luther King, in conjunction with a separate 2-volume set, Armageddon. Summary. What we have had here is a sordid tale of lies and a miscarriage of justice, awaiting for the birth of truth and justice. And for an epilogue, I just want to put this up. It's the coming future coverage of Hoover's war against MLK. To the right side there, you're looking at an FBI letter that Hoover made his agents write to Martin Luther King about all the salacious things they could dig up on him, that he shared with his wife. And we're trying to use this to get King to commit suicide with a threat that if he didn't, all this stuff would go public. I'll give you some time here, and what you should really do is just pause and read this whole letter. And that ends, or slide sets, on the emerging battle between two people, Martin Luther King Jr. and J. Edgar Hoover.